After the Berlin Conference, the Western European powers were carving up Africa. All of them had territories except one, Italy. As a relatively new, late coming to the game, Italy sought to catch up with the UK, France, Spain, Portugal, and Germany. What it didn't expect is the well-organized and strategic resistance they would encounter in Abyssinia, who would soon christen a new name for itself after a spectacular victory over the colonizing forces at the Battle of Adwa.
By a black army, and so it inverts the racial hierarchy of the day.
Ethiopia became the only African country never colonized because it refused to fight like a victim.
Also upsets the notion of white superiority, and this has impacts around the world.
As both forces lined up on the battlefront on March 1, 1896, for the landmark collision between the ancient kingdom of Ethiopia and the would-be kingdom of Italy, one thing was clear. One of the most significant military engagements in history was about to unfold, as it was the first time a modern European power was defeated by an African nation. And not just defeated, but resoundingly beaten. And through this victory, those from whom humanity started shatter the myth of European invincibility. And if Italy had done its homework, it would have realized that the descendants of the Axum Empire and the protector of the Ark of the Covenant, as you will see, are not to be underestimated. By the late 19th century, European empires were aggressively carving up the African continent. Italy, a relatively new nation seeking colonial prestige, set its sights on the Horn of Africa as its gateway to empire. In 1889, Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia and the Italian government signed the Treaty of Wuchale. On the surface, it promised friendship and alliance, but the document contained a calculated act of colonial deceit. The treaty had two versions. The Amharic version stated that Ethiopia could use Italy as an intermediary for dealings with other European nations, upholding Ethiopian sovereignty. The Italian version stated that Ethiopia must use Italy for all foreign dealings, effectively making Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. This is not too dissimilar to the current state of affairs, where most African countries have their independence on paper, but have no sovereignty to speak of, neither agrarian, technological, financial, or military. Francesco Crispi, a revolutionary turned autocratic, needed the victory and resources of a colony to 1. Distract away from domestic political scandals and a struggling economy. Crispi needed Abyssinia to complete his national unity project. Crispi felt Italy was being disrespected by other European powers, particularly France. He believed that to be taken seriously as a modern nation, Italy needed its own African empire. He viewed the conquest of Ethiopia as a way to assert Italy's prestige on the world stage. Leading up to 1896, Italy was plagued by internal turmoil, including the Fasci Siciliani, a socialist peasant movement in Sicily, and the Banca Romana scandal, a massive corruption case that implicated Crispi himself. He hoped a glorious military victory abroad would distract the public and restore his crumbling political support. Desperate for a quick victory to save his government, Crispi sent insulting telegrams to his military commander, General Oreste Baratieri, accusing him of cowardice and demanding authentic action. This political pressure goaded Baratieri into launching the rash and disorganized attack at Adwa. What the Italians would go up against is a state that had a leader that wanted to modernize its empire. From deploying a modern railroad, the first bank, telegraph, telephone, automobile, to ensuring his military had the most modern equipment with the latest guns purchased from Italian rivals. And so when, in 1891, Menelik II, founder of the modern Ethiopian state, who claimed to be descended from the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, discovered the discrepancy, he did not hesitate. He rejected the treaty entirely, sparking an inevitable military confrontation. Aware of the coming Italian attack, Menelik II started to unify all the nations from all over Ethiopia, galvanizing support for the defense of the nation, and Ethiopians responded in large numbers. And it wasn't just the men. The women participated in logistical support, from bringing supplies to the troops to providing medical support. Menelik united the country's fractious provincial rulers behind him. When he called for a mass mobilization in September 1895, he was able to raise around 80,000 to 120,000 troops, with men pouring in from almost all of Ethiopia's regions and ethnic groups. Meanwhile, Italy had advanced to within about 250 miles of Addis Ababa, the newly founded Ethiopian capital. Menelik, accompanied by Taitu, led his army north on what would become a 5-month march totaling nearly 600 miles. As Raymond Jonas, author of The Battle of Adwa, African Victory in the Age of Empire, writes, Menelik covered more ground than either William Tecumseh Sherman on his march to the sea or Napoleon on his ill-fated invasion of Russia. In December 1895 and January 1896, the Ethiopian army annihilated a vanguard Italian column at Amba Alaje. And then besieged an Italian fort at Mekele, forcing its surrender in large part by implementing Taitu's strategy of cutting off the water supply. The Ethiopians next slipped past the main entrenched Italian force and moved on to the Adwa area. Throughout, Menelik allegedly spread false rumors, downplaying the size and cohesiveness of his troops. This is one of the 19th century's greatest campaigns, an American historian said on a 2012 podcast. Cognizant of his lack of food, water, and accurate maps, Italian commanding officer Oreste Baratieri considered retreating into Eritrea. But on February 25, 1896, he received a telegram from Italian Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, essentially goading him into action. His subordinate generals likewise pushed for a decisive engagement, prompting Baratieri, who had earlier vowed to bring Menelik back to Italy in a cage, to advance 3 brigades. Italian successes at the beginning of the campaign were brilliant but fruitless, and large Ethiopian armies were threatening the Italian outposts at the end of 1895. Menelik's forces, which numbered more than 100,000, were well armed with modern weaponry. Menelik, however, shrewdly downplayed this military strength by leaking false reports indicating a much smaller number of troops under his command, and by spreading rumors that there was widespread discord among his forces. Now confident of his perceived superiority, and with the pressure from Rome and low supplies, Baratieri ordered his troops to march forward. Europeans often characterize the Ethiopians as tribesmen with spears. In reality, Menelik had purchased over 100,000 modern rifles and dozens of Hotchkiss artillery pieces from the French and, ironically, the Italians themselves prior to the war. He then trained his troops with a mix of traditional Ethiopian fighting and modern weaponry handling. The battle took place on a Sunday. Menelik, a deeply religious man, initially did not want to fight on a holy day. He was actually at church when the first shots were fired. The Italians thought they would catch the Ethiopians at prayer, but the army was so large that they were able to mobilize instantly. Ethiopian tradition holds that St. George himself appeared in the sky above the battlefield. This psychological factor was immense. Soldiers fought with the conviction that divine intervention was on their side, while Italian troops were unnerved by the religious fervor of the horde charging them. He ordered his troops to take position on the higher ground overlooking the interior Ethiopian plains. The terrain downhill from the Adwa hill was a jigsaw puzzle of natural trenches, difficult to navigate roads that the local Ethiopians knew, eyes closed. They were a nightmare for the Italians, who didn't want to venture there. They were reassured by the fact that no one could assail their position, or so they thought. The Abyssinians had total knowledge of the theater of war. So, as soon as Baratieri ordered his troops to march forward and take position on the hills off Adwa, Menelik was alert by his scout. It was exactly the type of move that he was waiting for. Here we must note the cunning strategic support from the Queen herself. Queen Tetu, who, in addition to being in charge of supply logistics, was also leading a division of the Ethiopian forces. It was Empress Taitu Betul, not the generals, who recognized that the fort's water supply was outside its walls. She commanded her own 5,000-strong battalion to seize the water source, forcing the Italians to surrender after 10 days of thirst. She conducted multiple raids on Italian supplies and destroyed as much of their food and water supplies as she could. This contributed to Baratieri's urge to hasten events. Emperor Menelik II used a sophisticated network of double agents. He sent deserters to General Oreste Baratieri with false information, claiming the Ethiopian army was starving, disease-ridden, and deserting. This baited the Italians into attacking a far more organized and larger force than they expected. The Italian commander, General Baratieri, actually wanted to retreat. However, Italian Prime Minister Francesco Crispi sent him a telegram calling his leadership cowardly. Stung by the insult, Baratieri ignored his own reconnaissance and ordered the ill-fated night march toward Adwa. On the night before March 1st, the Ethiopians used the dark of the night to advance their position. As soon as the Italians committed, their plans fell apart almost immediately. Their maps were poor, and the terrain was treacherous. In the darkness and confusion, the Italian brigades became separated and lost contact with one another. Instead of a unified front, they stumbled into the valley as isolated units. Contrary to Italian expectations of a surprise, Menelik's forces, numbering over 100,000, were fully prepared. They had anticipated the move and were already in superior positions on the high ground. At dawn, Menelik ordered the attack. The Ethiopian army, divided into three main divisions led by Menelik, Ras Makonnen, and Ras Alula, surged forward. The sound of modern rifle fire echoed through the valleys. The Ethiopians utilized their massive numerical advantage and knowledge of the land to surround the fractured Italian brigades. Empress Taytu's presence on the field provided a massive morale boost to the Ethiopian warriors. When some Ethiopian soldiers wavered during the heat of the battle, Taytu famously rode to the front lines, removed her veil, and shouted, "What are you doing? Victory is ours! Strike!" Her presence as a woman in the heat of combat was a massive morale booster that prevented a retreat. She was not only commanding her assault division, but she also made sure that the Ethiopian troops remained hydrated, because soon the scorching hot East African sun would weaken even the hardest of warriors. But for those who are not tropically adapted, the effects, as you will see, would be devastating. As the heat of the day rose, the Italians, exhausted from the night march and lacking water, began to buckle. The Eritrean Askari, seeing the tide turn and realizing the futility of their situation, began to defect or retreat in large numbers. By noon, the Italian lines completely shattered. Thousands of Italian soldiers and Askari lay dead, and thousands more were taken prisoner. Ras Alula, often called the Garibaldi of Abyssinia, was the mastermind behind the scouting. He knew the terrain so well that he positioned his troops in a crescent formation, essentially funneling the three separate Italian brigades into kill zones where they could not support one another. Realizing the battle was a total catastrophe, General Baratieri fled the battlefield, leaving his remaining men to fend for themselves. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed in October 1896, abrogated the Treaty of Wuchala and re-established peace. The Italian claim to a protectorate over all of Ethiopia was thereafter abandoned, and the Italian colony of Eritrea, finally delimited by a treaty of peace, September 1900, was reduced to a territory of about 200,000 square kilometers, 80,000 square miles. Ethiopia's victory was a declaration to the world. Italy was forced to sign the Treaty of Addis Ababa, formally recognizing Ethiopia's absolute independence. It solidified Menelik II's power and turned Ethiopia into a global beacon of resistance and pride for the entire African diaspora. Their status as icons of resistance was cemented. Menelik focused on modernizing Ethiopia's infrastructure, roads, bridges, and administration, until his death in 1913. Taytu remained a powerful political figure and played a pivotal role in the founding of Addis Ababa. General Baratieri returned to Italy in disgrace and was court-martialed for gross mismanagement and cowardice for fleeing the field. Though acquitted, his reputation was destroyed and he died in obscurity. Ras Makonnen continued his tireless work in diplomacy and modernization. His son, Haile Selassie I, would later lead Ethiopia through its next major struggle against Italian fascism. Overall, the Ethiopians inflicted a casualty rate of up to 70%. They brought the Italian prisoners back to Addis Ababa in what Jonas calls a racial turning of the tables that put whites at the mercy of blacks in significant numbers for the first time. Treated well, they were gradually released, whereas, in contrast, the Africans fighting alongside the Italians purportedly had their right hands and left feet amputated. After the defeat, Pope Leo XIII personally wrote to Menelik II to negotiate the release of nearly 3,000 Italian prisoners of war. Menelik agreed, showing a level of civilized diplomacy that shocked the European public, who had viewed him as a barbarian. In the aftermath of the battle, Crispi's government collapsed and Baratieri was put on trial. He was acquitted. Moreover, Italy agreed to recognize Ethiopian independence, as did other European powers, which negotiated with Menelik to settle the country's borders. Menelik's victory had farther-ranging consequences as well. Before Adwa, according to Haile, Europeans generally thought of Africans as primitive savages who would all be ruled over and eventually displaced by Europeans. But afterwards, Haile says, Europeans were forced to take Africans much more seriously.
And this has impacts around the world. In fact, in the States, one of the ways that I approached the topic was by looking at how the American press covered the story. And one of the earliest images of Menelik that went out in the American press showed an Ethiopian monarch who looked for all the world like he could be the Tsar of Russia, recently coronated. And then there were stories, too, that the Ethiopians weren't African at all, but in fact of Phoenician descent. There are different ways that people are struggling to come to terms with this very shocking outcome, trying to understand how this could happen and ultimately interpreting the events in ways that take the racial hurt, the racial dimension of the story away.
To maintain the loyalty of the diverse ethnic groups within his army, Oromo, Tigrayan, Amhara, etc., Menelik hosted a 3-day feast before the march. He used this to unite rival Razes, lords, against the common white threat, a feat of political diplomacy as great as the military win. The defeat was seen as a painful memory and a national humiliation in Italy. Mussolini sought vengeance, using modern aircraft and chemical weapons, mustard gas, to subjugate the nation. Menelik's victory over the Italians gave him significant credibility with the European powers, bolstered his mandate at home, and provided the Ethiopian kingdom with a period of peace in which it was able to expand and flourish, in contrast to most of the rest of the African continent at that time, which was embroiled in colonial conflicts. However, the spirit of Adwa remained. Even during the 5-year Italian occupation, 1936 to 1941, Ethiopian resistance never ceased. Ethiopia regained its independence in 1941, ensuring that the legacy of 1896 remained unbroken. There are a few lessons that Emperor Menelik II left for modern African nations. A blueprint for true independence. Menelik was a master of playing European powers against each other. Before Adwa, he used Italian funds and French-Russian diplomacy to import massive quantities of modern firearms and artillery, ensuring his army was better equipped than the invading Italians. He succeeded in uniting fiercely independent regional lords and diverse ethnic groups, including the Oromo, Sidama, and Guraje, under a single banner for the defense of the fatherland. By taking the name Menelik II, he linked himself to the legendary Menelik I, son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, reinforcing his divine right to rule and his role as a restorer of ancient greatness. And if we must take one thing away from the African kingdom that was never colonized, it is that a country cannot become a strong and secure empire until its army is strong. You cannot contract out national defense. You will inevitably fail when those better armed than you decide to take what is rightfully yours. And no amount of appeasement and diplomacy or human right declaration can save you. So you must unite to become stronger. Unite through mutual defense agreements. Stronger through local arms production. And especially stronger through a resilient local economy. And many of those lessons also extend to the diaspora and the Black American community. If you want to support Without History, do so via our YouTube or Patreon link. Your support keeps us independent. Join us and see how those who are said to be without history birthed civilization itself.
Europe was dividing Africa like a cake. Britain took this, France took that, Italy looked at Ethiopia and thought, easy victory. But Ethiopia was not a country they expected. It was a mountain fortress with a warrior culture and a leader who understood geopolitics better than Europe did.